First, pick out all the fabrics you might want to use for your dress. This was my selection. This is the fabric I decided to use for the skirt. I had about 2.5 yards, and I divided that into thirds, and I cut 3 sections. This width was perfect for the length I wanted for the skirt. So I was making this, cutting them so that it would be sewn together on the selvages to make a skirt that would go all the way around. It's about 24 inches. I cut each one about 24 inches in these 3 sections, and that is how I was able to make the skirt. So yes, this is just, you can just do the math. You want to cut, the width of your fabric is going to be your skirt. You don't need to really cut out a pattern piece for this dress. You can just use the width of your fabric and make it as long or as short as you want to. So this is what I was doing. So my skirt was about 24 inches, and you can measure the bodice is going to come down to just below your bust, about 1 inch below your under bust, and you can make the skirt as long as you want it to be. For the bodice, I'm not doing any embroidery, but I did 2 layers. I'm cutting 2 layers of a top fabric and a lining fabric. This is to give the dress a lot of sturdiness. Both of these are lightweight cotton, so I wanted them to be a little sturdier. So having 2 layers is going to help the dress. So I cut both layers together, and I cut a size medium for the bodice. I probably could have gone with a small, but the medium, just didn't want it to be very tight. When you're cutting out the pattern, you do want to cut out this neckline part. Again, I like to have the slit in the front of the dress, so it doesn't really matter where if you want the rounded part in the front or the slit part in the front. The dress doesn't have any fitting, so it doesn't really matter which way you want to wear it. And you can, switch things around if you want to, the notches, but it's not a big deal to have the front in the slit in the front or the slit in the back. Be sure to transfer all your markings to the fabric. This would be all the notches, the front notch and the side notches, so that you won't have any issues further on in making the pattern. On the bodice pattern, make sure you notice where the dots are on the pattern and transfer that. Also notice that one side is 3/4 inch seam allowance, the other is a 1/2 inch seam allowance. The 1/2 inch seam allowance is where you're going to put the waistband, and the 3/4 inch seam allowance is going to go directly to the skirt.
It's about the same for the front, but it looks like it has it at 1/2 inch.
This is another good time.
It's always a good idea to put all the fabric choices together before you do your final cuts to make sure you like the fabrics you're picking out to go together. This is a lot of fun, and you can make your changes now.
Let's see, I thought I had another fabric here.
Then you can cut out your sleeves. You can do your sleeves all in one color and tape the pattern pieces together to just cut one sleeve, or you can do what I'm doing, what traditionally is done, and do 3 different fabrics for the sleeve. This is my upper sleeve. It's really important to mark your pattern pieces for the pleat lines, as well as the stars, and notches is helpful too. We love using these Crayola ultra washable markers, but use what you like best. This is the second fabric I used for the sleeve, for the middle part of the sleeve. So I'm doing this one, and I'm going to flip it over and do the other, another sleeve. I will point out that I wanted my sleeve a little bit smaller, so I use the size small for these sleeves. But I highly recommend that you use the sleeve that matches your bodice. So if you're doing a size medium for the bodice, you cut the medium for the sleeve. This just helps with fitting everything together. They'll all fit together if you do the small with the small sleeves.
The cuff
etc.
etc. One size, and it's traditionally embroidered. You can see there's design.
And then I cut out the cuffs. You're supposed to cut 4. I did 2 different colors for the cuffs that are going to sort of match the bodice. So I cut 2 of each of these 2 different walls, and then I did 2 more. So
this is basically a line.
that's really all you need to do for the sleeves. So all that's left are the waistband and the gusset. We're going to cut 4 of the gussets, and that's because the skirt needs a lot of strength, and it helps to have that, and we're going to cut 2 waistbands. Again, they're going to be sewn together. So the waistband, we're cutting 2 of these. Again, they're going to be giving some strength to the bodice to hold the skirt up.
Decide later what side I want to use.
And we're going to cut 4 waistbands also to give strength to hold the skirt up.
There's just a little bit left.
You're going to sew the waistbands to each layer of what the pattern calls the front of the bodice. So each layer gets 1 waistband. They're sort of all layered there together, sandwiched together.
So now the waistband is on.
And then
bodice,
we
and
based
I'm going
the
to
all the layers
stitch
together along the side,
these
about
layers
1.5
together,
inches
1.5
from the
inches from
edge,
the
and
side,
leave
and really it's like a
open
basic
1.5
stitch
inches
right here
on
my machine,
on
and
either
I may
near the
stitch
bottom
this part as well, but
of the bodice,
this
the front and the
part,
back
the opening of
sides.
the neck is going to have a bias
And
binding
then
around it.
stay stitch
And so that is
around
what we do
the
next.
neckline edge as well.
So you can see I have.
You can see I stay stitched the neckline edge with small stitches and basted with the sides with longer stitches. This will give stability to the whole bodice while we do the rest of the steps.
So I can use. Okay, I
The neckline is finished with bias tape, and so I've made my own bias tape with some of the fabric I had on hand. This is a perfect way to use up scraps that you have in your stash, as well as to match or coordinate with the fabrics you're using in your dress. So I just cut this on the bias and putting them together, and then I'm going to use our bias makers, which we do sell in our shop, to make the bias tape binding, which will go around it. So this is just how I make bias tape. These little bias tape makers. I take the end of the bias, the little needle,
Feed it into
push it into the bias tape maker.
I use a pin right here to.
Once it's fed through,
to start it.
pull it out from the end, and then I
then
use an iron to
can start pulling it
press
through.
the folded
Using your
bias as it's
iron,
coming through
just
bias tape maker. So
press
it's
it.
very simple. Sometimes it takes a little adjusting when you
Open.
first start
Sometimes
it
this
to make
first
sure
little bit
everything's
takes a
getting
little-
folded or coming
little
out
finagling.
as you want it to be. But it's really easy, and
But
it's
you
a great
can
way to
just
pretty quickly
press
make
just
bias
like that.
tape. So this will be
And it
single-sided
makes
bias
a
tape. When you
nice
fold it over, it's then double-sided.
1/4 inch single fold bias tape. It's a 1/2 inch on the wide side, 1/4 inch on each of these little wings. And you just go nice and slow. And that's all there is to it. Quite simple, and you make it with just about any kind of fabric.
So I take the bias tape, and on the wrong side of the bodice, I'm going to pin, folding over a 1/2 inch at the first end and pinning all the way around the neckline, down the slit, around the slit, and back up. Now this is a little bit tricky. The bias tape definitely helps because it'll curve fairly well. But the very bottom, you just want to do the best you can to get around that very, very tight curve at the bottom. And you can adjust as you need to, or baste it in place first and then come back and stitch. I'd stitched this, and then I had to come back and unpick a few stitches that had caught some of the bodice that was not right there underneath that slit. And then I just sewed it again, and it worked out well. So just be a little careful with that. Go slow, take your time. And once this is all pinned, you'll sew all the way around the neckline and then fold the bias tape all the way over to the right side, and we'll hand stitch the bias to the neckband, just enclosing the neckband in this, or the neck area with this bias tape. And here's just a close-up really fast of a short bit of hand stitching. We just whip stitch this bias down over the front of the dress over top of the seam line. So now we move on to the sleeves. This is the upper sleeve. And the first thing to do is to make the pleats. And the easy way to do the pleats is to cut 1/4 of an inch, barely 1/4 of an inch, into the seam line at the pleat lines. This allows you to fold the pleats easily. So you'll fold from the pleat line to the dots. And, you know, this is just an easy way to do. Try to get as accurate as possible, but you can adjust this later when you're putting the sleeve in. The pleats are supposed to go from back to the front, but it doesn't really matter. You can have the sleeve face either direction that you want it to face. You could even gather this area if you prefer. The pleats are traditional, but it's not, you can do either one. Totally fine to gather it if you like. I like the pleats, but you'll use all the pleats for all sizes except for the large, and for the large you'll only use 4 pleats. But if you have issues with fitting, or you, like I did, made the small sleeve for the medium bodice, where I had to remove 2 of these pleats on either side to make it fit, which was fine. Again, there's not a lot of hard and fast rules about this. These will work if you're using the right sizes, and they're quite pretty. Once you get your pleats basted, then you just put the other 2 pieces of the sleeve on. They're really quite simple, like piecing it together, and then you move on to the gusset. Line up the gusset with the stars. This is the most important part. The stars align with each other. And you're gonna have the 2 layers of the gusset together. So you're putting two pieces of gusset against one sleeve. This is the upper sleeve. And you can see how this lines up on the sleeve. This is an important part. It'll make it so much easier. You're gonna sew from the star to the edge of the gusset, right where I'm pinning. And then you'll do the other side. It's very simple, but it's not a traditional, typical, I guess not, it is traditional, but it's not a typical arm sleeve that we're used to using. So just sew from the edge to the star and backstitch at the star. So once you have that done, you will sew the gusset to the other side of the sleeve. So you just fold the sleeve in half, and again, the stars will align. So the star on the gusset will align to the star on the sleeve, the other side of the sleeve. And you can see that's what I'm doing now. You're gonna sew from the star to the edge of the sleeve on the gusset, sewing the gusset and the sleeve together. So the star matching up, and you can just pin it there and then pin it to the other edge, and you can see the pleats are at the top of the sleeve right there. So this is the bottom of the sleeve, the underarm of the sleeve. And this is really simple, but it is a little tricky if you're not used to using gussets. Now that both sides of the gusset are sewn onto the sleeve, you can see right there, we are going to sew the rest of the sleeve together. This is the underarm of the sleeve, and you just sew from that star you just line up your stitching so it just meets up with the stitching where the star is, where the gusset and sleeve come together, and you sew all the way down to where the end of the sleeve, where the cuff will go. So we're gonna sew there all the way down. And you can see this is finished sleeve now. We got the stitching to line up and turn the sleeve inside out, or right side out. And there is the finished gusset at the top of the sleeve. That's the bottom of the sleeve where the gusset is. The top of the sleeve has the gathering stitches, and the whole sleeve is put together now. The last thing to do for the sleeve is the cuff. You will take these two cuffs and the extra two cuffs that you have left over and sew them together at the ends. And once they're sewn together, they will go right sides together onto the sleeve at the end. And you'll sew around the sleeve, turn this cuff to the inside of the sleeve, and you will turn under 1/2 inch on the raw edge, and that will just be whip stitched down inside the sleeve. So here's the cuff attached to the sleeve. The 1/2 inch is pressed down to the wrong side, and just turn this cuff up inside the sleeve, and you just whip stitch that folded edge over the seam line, and you have a nicely finished cuff with two different, has a facing, basically the cuff with a facing, and with two different fabrics, and it's quite pretty. Now we get to the waistband, and you see the two layers of the waistband, and we have the basting stitches there. Now we're going to flip this over so the wrong side is facing up, and pin this the inside facing, basically the lining, away from the edge while we attach the sleeve to the bodice. So we'll do this to both sides, and once it's pinned away, we'll attach the sleeve to the bodice. So you'll remember that we had the markings on the sleeve where the notches for the front and back of the sleeve and the dots, and then there's a dot on the waistband as well. And so you're going to line up the dots on the gusset, the sleeve gusset, with the dots at the waistband and at the other end, and then you will line up the sleeve notches on the sleeve with the sleeve notches, or the notches on the bodice. So this is a pretty easy way to do it. Again, if you want to make sure you're getting the front to the back so that your pleats are going the way that the pattern says they ought to, you can do that. You don't necessarily have to do that. So you could be lining up the your notches may not line up, but everything should work out fine if you're putting, it doesn't really matter if you put the front or the sleeve on the front the right ways or wrong ways, because there's no fitting to this pattern that would matter for that. You just want this part to line up. You want the everything to line up so that it finishes at the same length. So for me, I had to adjust and take out a couple pleats to make it work, because again, I was using a medium bodice and a small sleeve. But it worked out perfectly, and that is exactly how it should be. So your gusset pieces line up with the bottom of the front and back part of the bodice, and everything else should match notches if that is what is working for you. So once you have your sleeve pinned to your bodice, you will sew from one dot all the way around the sleeve to the other dot on the gusset, and you can leave the 1/4 inch open at the bottom if you want. This is important for the traditional pattern. It doesn't really matter if you're going to do the narrow skirt, and that's just because you're going to finish the whole bodice bottom before you do anything else. Now, once both sleeves are on, you're going to turn under that little bit of the bodice lining that was left, and you're by 1/2 inch to the wrong side, and you're going to just, again, whip stitch over just to the seam of the sleeve, and that finishes the seam really nicely on the inside. And now your bodice is done. This is what I'm going to use as the front of my bodice, and we'll flip it over. This is what will be the back of my bodice. You can see there's a waistband on this side and not on the other side. That's all there is to it. Then we work on the skirt. You'll sew the panels together at the sides, and then important part is to make really strong gathering stitches at the top of the skirt. And I do this in 2 sections so that in case threads break, it's because you're gathering a lot of fabric. Once you get the gathering done on the skirt, you're going to put the skirt with the right sides together to the bodice. This is for the more modern version, not the traditional version. The traditional version has a fuller skirt and needs a little bit of extra strength, and the pattern talks about how to do that. So adjust the gathers so that they're even. I put one of my skirt seam lines to the back of the bodice, and then just adjust everything so it's even, pin it all together, and you'll be ready to sew it together. So again, this is a lot of fabric, so you're going to sew with a 3/4 inch seam line to give it plenty of strength, and you just sew all the way around with the right sides together. So you can see the 3/4 inch seam line right here gives it that strength, and now you can turn the fabric to the right side, and you can finish the seam with a serger or zigzag stitching over that, and then you're going to stitch a top stitch along the top right above the skirt. This again just to give some strength to that fabric to hold the skirt up. And then my whole dress is finished once the hem is done. And I just made a narrow hem on this skirt and finished it up.